Ian Leslie writes about psychology, culture, technology, and business for the New Statesman, The Economist, The Guardian, and the Financial Times. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and he was the 2019 Spring Fellow at the American Library in Paris. Leslie is a writer, speaker, and author of books on human behaviour, including Born Liars on Lying and Self-Deception, Curious on the Trait of Curiosity, and tonight's book, Conflicted, on the Art and Science of Productive Disagreement. Conflicted was published by Faber and Faber of February this year. Ian, thank you so much for being with us at the library. It's such a pleasure to host you.
Very nice to be here. Thank you, Alice.
And welcome back, of course.
Yeah, it's great to be not back in Paris, but almost. Yeah, I wish I was.
I wish you were back. Yeah, well,
yeah.
If you know, we'll just have to redo this again in person, the same event.
Yeah.
Okay, my first question for you, Ian, is why write a book about conflict and why now?
Well, it started off being a slightly different kind of book than the book it turned out to be. So I was just looking around me on social media and elsewhere, but perhaps because I spend too long on Twitter, I started thinking about this in terms of social media. I was just seeing so many toxic arguments, really bad, futile, stupid disputes that just seemed to generate poison, you know, sort of they were gaseous, you know, they didn't really kind of produce anything except bad feelings. And I started off thinking, I need to write a book about how everyone needs to get along better, and we can kind of put conflict like this aside and just talk through our differences calmly. And then I thought, well, that's quite boring, first of all. But also, the more I thought about it and researched the topic of disagreement and conflict, the more I realized that there are immense benefits to it. And that actually it's central to how we think. It's central to how we relate to one another. And that actually, under the right conditions and done in the right way, it makes us collectively more intelligent, more creative, and actually counterintuitively brings us closer together. Even quite heated argument and conflict brings us closer together. And not having it kind of corrodes our relationships in a way that we don't really see because it's not so obvious. So actually, those toxic disputes that you see on social media are kind of the tip of the iceberg, and they're not really the problem. The problem is partly because people see those disputes, is that people avoid disagreement and conflict all the time, and because they expect it to become like that. Well, I think it's partly because they expect it to go wrong because they see so many bad examples of it, particularly now, right? So you know, you're seeing these very public bad examples of poisonous disagreement, and that combined with, well, a much deeper kind of historical trend, which is we live in far bigger, more diverse in every sense, and more egalitarian societies than we have done in any point in human history. There is nothing in our evolutionary heritage or our cultural heritage until relatively recently that has prepared us for this kind of society. So, you know, for most of human history, and of course I'm simplifying hugely, but you know, that's just what I do. So you have to bear with me. For most of human history, much of what you think, much of your allowable kind of opinions were settled for you by tradition, by hierarchy.
Can you give a concrete example?
Yeah, so if you think about, like, just to take a kind of a microcosm,
yeah,
within the home, within the family, it really only kind of 50 or 100 years ago, a lot of the day-to-day kind of roles and opinions that were expressed within the family were decided for you. you know, it was pretty much a given that the man was going to do the work and the woman was going to do the housework, right? Unless you wanted to contradict, you know, go against mainstream conformist norms. It was a given that parents talk to children in a certain way and children talk to parents in a certain way, right? So if you think about the family now, you know, much to my dismay, it's not like that at all. And everything is, you have, so everybody's got the right to their own voice, everybody's got the right to their own opinion, including children. And it becomes this mini kind of democracy. Yeah, almost too much.
Yeah.
So therefore you have to talk everything out, and you have to, you know, that creates huge potential for disagreement. And basically you see that same dynamic at every level, whether you're talking about the family, the workplace, or society, and so on. We're now in this kind of hugely, brilliantly, gloriously diverse, cacophonous society where everybody's expected to speak their mind. And when that happens, you find plenty to disagree with.
And certainly online.
And online, it's kind of, you know, it's instant and constant, and you just, there's a parade of disagreeable opinions that go past your, you know, your vision, like at 100 miles an hour, just all the time. So the idea that you're kind of in a filter bubble on social media is not quite right. I mean, it's true in some ways, but in other ways, the whole problem is you're not in your filter bubble anymore. You know, I grew up in a household where we basically read The Guardian, we watched the BBC News. That was a filter bubble. It's a very nice one. In some ways, I wish I could go back to that. I can't now. You know, there's just like all sorts of opinions, many of them very different from mine, many of them stupid, some of them brilliant, but a lot of, you know, huge kind of mix. And it's just sort of parading past me all the time.
Right.
And I looked at some interesting research by a neuroscientist who sort of studies the neuroscience of outrage. And she said, look, you don't walk around the streets being outraged by things like, and she actually did a study on this, you know, the number of times that somebody is morally outraged in sort of in real life, you know, is very few. But it's like 12 times a day on social media, you'll see something that morally outrages you. So there's this weird kind of, you know, disjunction. And we're all adjusting to it. And the thing is, nobody comes along and tells you this is how to disagree well. You know, it's actually a skill. It's something you have to learn. You can really screw it up, or you can avoid it. Neither of those options are healthy. But I just think people need some help in order to do it productively.
So you're here to help. And we'll talk about the ways in which you know, suggest kind of, as you say, suggestions for a productive conflict, productive arguments. Ian, you use the word counterintuitive, and this is kind of, you know, central to your argument, which is that a lot of people don't want to have conflict, or there are certain misconceptions about what conflict is, and you spend, you know, parts of the book certainly kind of dispelling these misconceptions. Can you just kind of go through what are the kind of misconceptions that you were kind of fighting against?
Well, I think one of them is that you should avoid it. I mean, quite frankly, and you see this in the literature on and just the general kind of rhetoric and discourse around relationships, right? So actually, in an early part of the book, I start with relationships, and then the book kind of then builds up into gradually to the workplace and to society. But you can look at a couple almost as a microcosm of all these things. And one of the kind of the conventional pieces of advice from relationship columnists and until recently from academics who studied these things was that you should avoid heated arguments, and that when couples have differences of opinion, they should, in inverted commas, talk it out, right? Talk it through, which means talking things through very calmly and rationally. And
with lots of passive aggressive kind of undertones.
No, exactly. Now this is basically the issue. It becomes passive aggression, and anytime you don't have your disagreements out, and you don't have them out quite, you know, emotionally, they don't go away. That they become submerged into passive aggression. And psychologists have studied different forms of conflict, and they all have different uses at different times. The only one that just really never generates anything useful or interesting is passive aggression. Passive aggression is pretty much bad for relationships. It's bad for teams, it's bad for couples. It's like silently corrodes, it's like acid, kind of eats away. Now, I'm sure I'm guilty of it myself, but it's the one kind of form of conflict to avoid. So, and in recent years, the people that study couples really closely have quantified and built an evidence base to show that something slightly surprising, at least to them, maybe not to the rest of us, that the couples who are actually quicker than most to get into heated arguments, who have quite a low threshold of, right, let's get into it, are actually the ones who are most likely to survive and thrive as couples. They're the ones who are most likely to feel satisfied in their relationship. They're the ones who are most likely to solve their problems. And
why is that? Why does fighting actually strengthen relationships?
One of the psychologists who studies this put it to me like this. She said, conflict is information. When you're in a conflict, you are revealing to each other what you really think and what you really feel in a way that you don't necessarily do, even in an intimate relationship. That there's some sort of veil of politeness or just passivity and just avoidance that sort of surrounds most relationships. And in an argument and particularly an argument where there's some emotion and some heat involved, that kind of gets ripped away, and suddenly you learn that your partner really cares about your drinking or your messiness or whatever it is, to a degree that you didn't really realize. And so your kind of your mental model of your partner is updated in every kind of argument you have. You're suddenly like, oh, I get it. Now I understand a bit more about what she cares about. I might not agree, but now I have a kind of closer idea of what she thinks and what she feels, and vice versa.
Right, but so initially it's not really about the content of the argument, as it were, because the content could be about anything. It could be about you haven't done the dishes, why didn't you pick up the kids, because then it seems like what you're saying is then it will reveal the truth, but the truth isn't necessarily there at the beginning of the argument. The truth arrives.
Yeah, but there's that word content is really interesting, right? Because there's basically two levels.
Form. And we can add in form too.
We can what, sorry?
Form, content, form and content.
Yeah. Although actually the one I was going to add was so communication scientists, or psychologists, they talk about these two levels that are going on in any conversation, but particularly during an argument. There is the content level and there's the relationship level, right? And the content level is the thing that we are talking about, just as you said, right? So we are arguing about who does the dishes, right? Underneath that content level is an unarticulated, silent, but actually fundamental conversation going on, which is, what do you think about me? And what do I think about you? How are you treating me? And am I getting enough respect from you? Am I getting enough affection from you? And that relationship level is rarely verbalized, but it has to be settled to the satisfaction of both parties before you can get into the content level. You can't really have a really good disagreement at the content level until that relationship level is settled. And often when a disagreement goes wrong is because one party is really focusing only on that content level and is missing all the signals about the relationship level, right? You might or might not be surprised to learn that it's usually men who focus on the content level and women who are worrying about the relationship level and getting increasingly frustrated by the fact that the man is not getting it. Now, this is interesting, by the way, that when they, in laboratory experiments, when they pay the man to focus on the relationship level, he does it. Like, he can do it. It's just a question of motivation. And
you're also saying we might not be surprised to hear that men are motivated by money.
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. But so it actually seems to be a function of the sort of power relationship in any, whether it's a romantic relationship or anything else.
Right.
The more powerful person is not worrying about the relationship so much. The less powerful one is thinking like, am I being respected here? And so part of the way to have a better disagreement, to have a good disagreement, is to be attentive to that relationship level. And often the person that you're talking to, if they seem to be behaving irrationally or aggressively, emotionally, in inverted commas, it's probably because they're not happy with that relationship part of the communication, and you need to do something to make that work, because otherwise neither of you will be able to focus on the content, right? So we can take this out of the home, we can take this out of relationships. That could happen in the workplace, that can happen anywhere.
Yeah, let's go. That's great. Let's go to those places. So you talk about conflict in relationships, and you also, as you just mentioned, talk about the workplace, even on an individual level, even kind of in groups, bands. We could talk about maybe bands. Let's actually talk about, I suppose, the workplace is a good realm to go to next. So how is conflict productive, as it were, or positive for the workplace, because it's different?
Yeah, it's different but the same. So it's different because you're not dealing with intimate relationships, but the same principles apply. Now in this context, it's often called task versus relationship, but it's the same thing, right? A team, a group of people at work can be talking about the task at hand, the thing that we've got to get done, or the decision that we've got to make. But unless people feel that the relationship between the team members is settled in some way, and it's not a thing we have to worry about, then it quickly becomes a kind of ego struggle or a struggle for dominance. So what you're always trying to do, either as a leader or just as a person engaged in the disagreement, is you're trying to kind of level that and that might mean making the other people or the other person feel a little bit more secure about their status in their conversation, right? So you might say to the other person, look, I want to start off by saying, I think you really respect all the work you've done on this. It's been amazing. Something like that is immediately going to settle them down. What we're trying to find is a way to stop people from being on the defensive, because people find disagreement stressful. They find it to be like a threat. And so you're always trying to send a signal that says, you don't have to see this as a threat. This is one of the things I learned from hostage negotiators and interrogators who said similar things. So a hostage negotiator, a good one, is trained not to just get into the negotiation the moment they start talking to the hostage taker, right? So they get briefed on the situation, then they talk to this person. This person is under a lot of stress, right? Under huge pressure. Often they're doing this because they're they're in some sort of emotional crisis. And so if you pick up the phone and you say, right, here's what we need to do. This is, you give us this, we'll give you this. That person is going to feel like that you're trying to dominate them, right? Because they already feel insecure. So they're going to get defensive. And when you get defensive, you often get aggressive, right? And so the negotiator picks up the phone and spends a few minutes just saying things like, listen, I just want to say, first of all, we can see that you're doing a great job. Like, we really, we appreciate the fact you got everything under control here. You've really handled this well. You're handling it calmly. And the other guy's going, yeah, I have handled this well. And he's like,
I love your Zoom background. I love how you arranged your Zoom background.
Yeah, right. Lovely Zoom background. Nice choice. You've really got great taste. I mean, that might be getting a bit far, but that kind of thing. So they establish. So with all these things, is a question of sequencing, right? So focus on that relationship level first, then get into the content, right? It's a very simple version of this. It's more complicated than this in real life a lot of the time, but that's actually a good framework. Just think, okay, how can I kind of settle the relationships in this room, in this conversation, before we get into the thing that I really want to get into? Because unless we do that, it's going to keep kind of disrupting the conversation. Yeah. So, oh gosh, I wanted to read this extract from, because talking about office politics, I love this bit from, I wrote a section on Southwest Airlines, because Southwest Airlines for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, it's a very, very successful airline. It's actually the most successful airline in the world. It's been profitable up until the pandemic for like 30 years straight, which is pretty much unheard of in the airline industry, which is so up and down. And the reason that's so go on.
Yeah, no, because of conflict. I mean, you can link it back to conflict.
The reason they're so successful is that they're incredibly good at collaboration, and part of that is the way they deal with conflict. And the reason that matters in any company, but it matters hugely in the airline industry, because the airline industry, which I didn't realize until I read this study of Southwest Airlines, is riven by office politics in a way that just makes every other company look like, you know, sort of peace and love and harmony. I'll just read this description from somebody that the academic interviewed who worked at a major airline, right? Pretty much kind of a standard major airline. And this respondent said, look, you know, you've got all these different functions, pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, ticketing agents, ramp agents, and they all have to work together to get a plane off the ground, right? And Southwest Airlines is better than any other airline at getting planes off the ground. Anyways, but this woman at this other airline said, look, at my company, gate and ticket agents think they're better than the ramp. The ramp think that they're better than the cabin cleaners. Then the cabin cleaners look down on the building cleaners. The mechanics think the ramp agents are a bunch of luggage handlers, right? And so you've got all these kind of different parts of the company who all kind of hate each other and are all constantly competing and jostling for position. And that makes those airlines incredibly unproductive because they spend most of their time arguing with each other. This is something to look out for when you start taking flights again. But Southwest Airlines deals with this by having, anytime any tension arises, they have what they call a come to Jesus meeting, where they get the two warring sides or potentially warring sides together, and it's mediated, but they say, go for it, right? Just tell us why you're upset. And actually getting the emotional bit out is really important. Getting the emotional table. What you're doing is really frustrating us, and we feel like it's making us, you know, hard to do our job, whatever. And that has proved to be an enormously kind of effective way to keep the team spirit strong. So they have very, very little of that rivalry and competition versus the other airlines.
Yeah, I mean, so the first half of your book, Ian, you know, you're almost creating a kind of counter narrative to how we think about conflict and presenting why you think it's positive. And then your second half of the book is fairly practical because you turn to what you describe as toolbox techniques, kind of DIY how to have conflicts. And so, you know, one is just have it. Yeah. And you present some other ones, you know, empathy is important, curiosity is important. You describe disrupting the script, and so, you know, be surprised by what you might encounter in your argument. Since, in the interest of time, what one or two kind of toolbox tips or techniques would you say are important?
So
most important.
So one of them is called let go of the rope, and there's a phrase that I picked up from an interrogation. Pardon?
What's the rope?
So it's a phrase that I picked up from an interrogation expert. I spent time with an academic who actually trains Britain's counter-terrorist police in how to interrogate terrorists, and so these guys are interrogating incredibly hard nuts, and one of the problems that interrogations fall into, probably the main problem, is that they become effectively power struggles, and Lawrence's advice is always, you know, don't get stuck into a tug of war, let go of the rope, right? So really good interrogators do not do what you see in the movies or on TV. They do not walk into the room, kind of slam their fists on the table and say, you got to tell me what you know, I'm going to throw the book at you, and, you know, etc. Actually, some of them, like the bad ones, do, because they've seen it on TV. That's really, sad, but there you go. The really skilled ones do almost the opposite of that. They sit down, they do not mumble over the reading of the rights bit, right? So they do not sort of say, you have the right not to talk, you have the right to a lower. Okay, let's get into it. They make a big deal out of that, in fact, right? So the really skilled ones will say, look, you absolutely have the right to not talk to me. You don't have to. I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you what to say. This lawyer can't tell you what to say. My colleague, none of us can tell you what to do, right? So this is up to you. You can leave the room, right? That's your right. You can leave the room if you want. I would just really like to know how you got here. I'm just interested in your story. And they are, by the way, like the one of the traits of a good interrogator is they're genuinely curious, right? They don't fake this stuff. They want to know, even if this person is terrible, right? Even if they've just, tried to kill their comrades or whatever. So I want to know what happened. And these guys, these hardened guys who've been trained exactly for this moment and, know all the techniques to avoid, to be silent and not say anything. They just gush. I mean, it just kind of comes out because they really do want to talk. And the interrogator sees his job not to push them into talking, but basically to remove the barriers to them talking and to let it come out. So, and one of the places,
how much, I mean, imagine it's such a subtle, the power dynamics and the tension in the room is so subtle. How much of it is also a question of silence and pause?
I think it varies from case to case, right? So, and it depends on the type of suspect you're talking to, but sometimes using silence can be very powerful, as long as you show that you're doing it because you're listening. You're actually ready for them to talk, right? You're not trying to intimidate them or psych them out. You're here because you want to know what happened. And even when they kind of know it's against their interest, they can have a very powerful urge to tell you what happened. So your job is to let them do it. It's interesting because they learned this technique, this approach, in part from addiction therapists. So addiction therapists went through a kind of revolution about 20 or 30 years ago, where the conventional approach prior to that had been, I'm going to tell you, basically, you're doing a very bad thing. You're addicted to alcohol. It's messing up your life. It's messing up your family's life. Look at yourself. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but not much, right? And it was kind of like, if the patient did not admit that he was doing this, that, you have to keep going until he's broken. It was an aggressive kind of, it was a dominance style of therapy. And the field really turned around after a couple of guys came up with a new way of doing it. They called motivated interviewing, where they said that's completely counterproductive. The moment you tell somebody to do something, they think of all the reasons they want to do it, right? Don't do drugs. Well, I like drugs. Don't do alcohol. And suddenly you think, I really like drinking. Screw you. Because we all have this, we hate being pushed around, right? It's one of the fundamental traits of being human, I think. We just we have this streak of perversity. And so far more effective, it turns out, is to say, basically, you tell me what's going on. Why are you here? Like, why are we even having this conversation? And just show that you are listening. And they will kind of get there themselves, basically. You can guide a little bit, you can help them get there, but your job is not to tell them what to think and what to do, because they just go the other way. So it's the same principle of, don't turn it into a tug of war. Disagreements, tense conversations, conflict-ridden conversations, almost, they're always erring towards almost kind of like, they head that direction unless you kind of pull them back and you try and take the power dynamic out of it, and you try and say, look, I'm listening to you, and I respect you. So let's talk about the thing that we're meant to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to your 13th point, Ian, on this kind of checklist. You write, only get mad on purpose. No amount of theorizing can fully prepare us for the emotional experience of disagreement. Sometimes your worst adversary is yourself. So in the case of addiction therapists or interviewers, they have a goal, right? They want the person to stop taking drugs, or they want the terrorists to confess. But a lot of us find ourselves in, it's not as if one would wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to have a great argument with my boss today because this, and it's kind of this, they don't have this kind of premeditated approach to conflict in the way that if it's your profession, you do.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Like, you're right. So in these situations, the goal is clear. And in a way, as incredibly tough as these jobs are, interrogation, hostage negotiation, that makes it a little bit easier.
And you witnessed, right? That was part of your research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I talked to them, and I also I took part in a training exercise where I sort of role played the part of an interrogator. And I had an actor playing a criminal.
And tell the audience how it went, because it's funny.
It went terribly. It went absolutely terribly.
Why?
Well, for several reasons, but one of them is one feels, if you're inexperienced at these things, that you have to present yourself as authoritative, right? So in this situation, I was the police interviewer, and in comes this suspect who we're pretty sure is a bad guy, and he's rude to me. He's sort of insolent, puts his feet on the table, and my instinct is to be like, "Hey, look, who do you think you're talking to? This is a police interview. And it's like, I could have been a teacher or a parent getting this wrong, because it's the same dynamic, right? You think, I have to be the one who seemed to be in charge here. And it gets you nowhere because that's what they want, right? In these situations, they want it to be a dominant struggle, because that's kind of what, certainly in the case of suspect, that's where they're comfortable. Almost their comfort zone is, I'm going to turn this into a fight. And the difficult thing is to let go of that and say, actually, it's not important that I'm looking, authoritative. What's important is that he talks, and that might require a whole different approach. So yeah, the other thing it teaches you is that it's very hard to keep control, to keep your objective in mind, even in that situation, because you're dealing with a kind of emotional turbulence of a very tough conversation at the same time as you're cognitively thinking, well, I need to get this information somehow from him. That's a very tough thing. And that does apply to, your everyday disagreements, even on social media, but yeah, at work and so on. There's that emotional stuff, and that narrows your cognitive bandwidth. And the thing that you have to try and do, and it's hard, is keep your eye on what the objective of this disagreement is, right? Are we disagreeing in order to get to truth or to a better decision, or has this become something else? Has it become a power struggle and so on?
So can you talk about the Wright brothers in this regard?
Yeah,
because I think they're a great example of disagreeing with a point in mind.
Yeah, so the Wright brothers, we all know that they invented the aeroplane. But I mean, I don't know about you, but I slightly perhaps underestimated them, because actually when you just look a little bit closer at their story, you go, wow, that's incredible. The problem of manned flight was something that people all around the world were working on at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And you had these great engineers and technologists and scientists and institutions working on this problem. And these two guys who didn't have a PhD, they ran a bike shop in Dayton, Ohio, right? These two guys, complete amateurs, cracked it before anyone else. Now, clearly they were brilliant, right? Clearly they were obsessive. But one of the things that made them get there fast before anyone else was that they multiplied their two brains by disagreeing really hard, by arguing really hard and really hot all the time, because it was what they did. It was their way of relating to one another. They were completely comfortable doing it. They loved each other. They were close, but they argue. So if you walked past that bike shop, if you were a local, you'd just hear them shouting. And it was, people were like, oh my gosh, they're going at it again. But they'd been sort of trained in that process by their dad, who sat them down at the dinner table, said, right, Wilbur, you take this side of the argument, Orville, you take this side, and at half an hour's time, we're going to swap you around and you take the other side. So it was a kind of, Socratic exchange. And they saw it as a way of getting to truth much more quickly, because you knock out the bad arguments, and only the strongest arguments survive. And it, got them to this innovation just at incredible speed.
And by the same token, you said that like a relationship is kind of a microcosm of society. And I read an interview with you, and you said in some ways a band is also a microcosm of society. And I love this phrase of, there was one kind of band he split up, I think it's the Beautiful South, English band. And they split up because, for many reasons. And you described like lack of conflict in a band leads to a creative moribund.
Creative, yeah. So it's
safe and boring. It's safe and boring. Whereas bands like the Beatles, REM, the Rolling Stones, they're fighting, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, so the Beautiful South, who are a very successful British band, most bands, the cliche is they split up because of musical differences. The Beautiful South said we split up because of musical similarities.
Right.
We just weren't having any arguments anymore. The rock band is like a microcosm, of society in a way, and also businesses, right? They're startups. You have this bunch of like talented guys who are all specialists in one particular thing, and they all have to come together. They're all quite, often quite egotistical, creative people, and they have to find a way to make it work as a team so that they become more than the sum of their parts. And most of them split up. I mean, so we only know about the ones that survive. And a rock critic who spent a long time observing bands and has been in bands said to me, and this is what provoked this line of thinking, he said, in my experience, the bands that stay together and succeed are not the ones I see high-fiving after gigs and hugging each other saying, hey man, you were great. He said that, no, those ones I see, I know they're going to go by the wayside. The ones that stay together have enormous respect for each other's talents, but they also like have their arguments out. And there's a lot of creative conflict and tension in the band. Different bands handle it in different ways. So the Rolling Stones, actually, I tell a story about the Rolling Stones. So there's a story in the book about the Stones where, it's actually from Keith Richards' autobiography, where he and Mick have been, and Charlie have been out on the town in Amsterdam. They get back to their hotel, and Keith and Mick go up to Mick's suite, and they decide and have a few more drinks. They order some smoked salmon, and I don't know what else they do. Jam.
Do some light cocaine.
Yeah, probably. And Mick decides to call Charlie Watts and get him up there, and he calls Charlie on the hotel phone. He says, "Oh, Charlie, where's my drummer?" And that's my Mick Jagger impression. Is
that your impression?
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
And there's a click at the end of the line, silence. So they go back to chatting, and about 15 minutes later, there's a knock at the door. It's Charlie Watts. He's beautifully turned out in a Savile Row suit, freshly cologned, hair combed, and he smacks Jagger in the face. I mean, he hits him so hard that he actually kind of falls over onto the smoked salmon and nearly falls out the window. And he says, "Don't ever call me your drummer again." And that's it. They move on. They don't split up. They don't, 50 years later, whatever it is, there's 30 years later, they're still with us. And that's how the Stones dealt with conflict. They didn't always hit each other. And I'm not advising that, by the way. This is not a healthy workplace culture, but it is exemplary of the way that they had their disagreements out, and then they were done, and then they got on to the next thing. So that festering tensions and passive aggression were not really so much a feature of that group. And REM were slightly different. So REM, I spoke to their manager for many years, and he said that they just talked everything out. And they would get into arguments, but it was it was almost a literally democratic discussion. I like the fact that we're from Athens in Georgia, because it was quite Athenian. They would have a discussion about every decision they took. And if one of them disagreed with it at the end of the discussion, they wouldn't take the decision, right? So different bands handle disagreement in different ways, but they do handle it. They do have a kind of way of dealing with it. And the bands that just avoid it are probably not going to survive for very long.
So Ian, how has writing the book helped you handle disagreement in your own life? I mean, have you noticed a difference? So in your acknowledgements, you write, this first line of your acknowledgements, you say, this book is the product of many illuminating conversations and useful agreements. What were some of the useful agreements that you had about the book? And with whom do you like to disagree?
Well, I disagree with everyone now. I'm just constantly disagreeing. It's become really annoying. I'm just much more likely to. I feel less stressed about disagreeing. That's the truth. And
were you stressed before?
Yeah, I'm not I don't like it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of conflict averse, and that's partly why I became interested in it. It was like, how can I get somebody like me to feel more comfortable with it and to reap some of the benefits of it, once I'd established that there were enormous benefits. And kind of the mission of the book really is to help people get more comfortable with it and feel like it's a natural part of life and not this kind of weird aberration that you kind of fall into now and again. So I'm more likely to have disagreements with my wife, with my children. I'm more likely to have disagreements with my wife in front of my children, rather than, saying, well, we'd better go and have this argument somewhere else. Like it's some sort of shameful thing that we can't do in front of the children. We're more likely to see, not in a, we're not ripping strips of each other, but if there is something we disagree about, I'm more likely to have it out in front of the children so that they learn that it's fine, and they've almost learned that lesson too well, actually. I mean, now I can't stop them from disagreeing with me about everything and not doing what I tell them. And the way I feel about it is like exercise, where it can be uncomfortable in the moment. I actually don't enjoy being at the gym or going for a run, but I can enjoy it. And actually, even if I didn't, I would be doing it anyway because I know it's really good for me. And it's a little like that. It can be a little, disagreement should be a little bit tense, right? There should be a little bit of tension in it, and therefore a little bit uncomfortable. But actually, it can be enormously satisfying. And I think under the right conditions, you just gain an awful lot from it in all sorts of ways.
Lovely. Thanks, Ian. So now we're opening up to the part of the event, which is question and answer or comments. So if you haven't posted your question or comment, please go ahead and post it in the chat. If you've just joined us, you have stumbled in on a wonderful presentation of Ian Leslie's new book, Conflicted, the English subtitle, because I have to obviously support the English publisher, why arguments are tearing us apart and how they can bring us together. So yeah, please go ahead and post your question. We've had a few questions about cultural differences. So right at the beginning, when you started talking about passive aggression, Emily posted, do you think that passive aggressive behavior is more widespread in British culture? And then Diane, and they're kind of related, Diane writes, I like the proposed question about the way different cultures vary in the way they respond to problems. I like the British tendency to apologise when something goes wrong and to explain the problem. This does not happen as much in Italy, my current home country, or in the USA. France, of course, has its own style of this. Could you speak to cultural differences in handling disagreement, Ian?
Yeah.
Having done your research in France.
Yeah, and indeed talked to French people about disagreement, and I touched on this briefly in the book. I was talking to a French journalist about the theme of the book, and I mentioned that in Britain we have this kind of rule that no politics or religion at the dinner table, and I sort of assumed that was a universal stipulation. And she said, "Really? Oh God, it's complete opposite here. we can't wait to talk about that stuff. You know, we sit down, we get ready for a meal, it's nice and polite, but we're all thinking, right, who's going to throw the first grenade into, we're going to talk about, you know, the yellow jackets, and we're going to get into it. This is it. This is the whole point. And so there's a much more kind of positive culture of argumentation in France. Now, different countries, yeah, vary. And I think it varies according to certain dimensions, right? So the way I talk about it in the book is high context societies and low context societies, or high context cultures and low context cultures, which is a distinction from anthropology and linguistics. And basically in a high context culture, tend to be governed more by traditions and by social norms. So what you're talking about is very much influenced by the context, by who you're with, the positions they hold in the social hierarchy. So it's a weird example. Let me give you an example of a high context communication culture. I would say the mafiosi, right? I've never been in a mafia meeting, but imagine in a mafia meeting, they don't say much explicitly when they're talking about who they're going to knock off, right? This is the way it works in the movies anyway. They just have to send a few signals, raise an eyebrow. Everybody knows what everybody's talking about without saying it directly, and it gets done. There's some countries are more like that than other countries, right? So again, generalizing widely, but Asian countries, China is a high context culture. There's a great emphasis on relationships, on everybody kind of giving each other the correct amount of respect. That's actually more important than giving your opinion, you know, having it all out there. And conflict is seen as a little bit unwelcome and a little bit gauche, something to be approached only obliquely. A low context culture, you can't rely on traditions or social norms because low context cultures tend to be much more diverse. There's a higher turnover of people. You've got different people come from different backgrounds, and you just have to verbalize everything. So there's many more words in a low context conversation. And there's many more opinions. You articulate everything. You say what I'm thinking. You speak your mind, right? You're not waiting to be told what to do by tradition or by norms, and therefore there's a lot more conflict, right?
So like America, for example.
Like in, let's say America's a low context culture, right?
Yeah.
And so, but then within societies, you'll find low context. I talked about the mafiosi as a kind of culture unto itself. Even in your own life, you'll move through low context and higher context. Maybe with your own family, it's like a high context situation where everybody knows, you know, what not to say, what to say, or you can just say signal with a certain kind of, you know, oblique reference and everybody gets it, right? Whereas if you're with a new group of colleagues, you know, you're in a low context culture there and everybody's got to kind of say things out loud. So I think that the kind of the Asian emphasis on hierarchy and tradition, relatively speaking, means that they have less open argument and debate. But there too, they are also moving towards a more low context world. The other interesting thing here is that the internet is inherently low context. So the internet, which is really becoming our global culture, is low context by design, right? It's incredibly diverse. You don't know who you're talking to. You're often having to, you can only use words, so you can't use any of these other subtle social signals where you can use, yeah, this is a little bit different. You get more kind of context over video, but even then it's very different. So we are moving towards a more low context world, and therefore, yeah, more kind of primed for disagreement.
Lovely. Robert wants to know, and this is kind of related to a question that I had, Ian. He writes, does your book have a section about international relations and the conduct of states? Do the same considerations apply to diplomacy? You know, in other words, moving away from disagreements between, you know, you and me, or me and my sister, or
yeah. I mean,
me and my friend. And then then I would like to add on to Robert's question. What about inner conflict with self?
Yeah, so okay,
two questions.
The first one is a resounding yes. And in fact, there's you know, as you know, I talk about society and politics, so it kind of scales up from you and me, and couples to right up into, you know, political and intergovernmental kind of, and in fact there's a chapter on the Oslo Accords, you know, sadly quite a resonant one at the moment, which was a peace process probably that made a lot of progress. I didn't go where in the end it failed, like everything's failed over the last few decades, but it succeeded more than most, and part of the reason was that it was done in an incredibly unconventional way for all sorts of reasons, starting from the fact that it was held in a back channel in Oslo, you know, in the middle of a snowy way, you know, countryside, rather than in the halls of Washington, DC or Rome or Paris in some sort of grand residence. It was in a wooden house in Oslo, and they got to know each other first before they got into the negotiation. So again, it was kind of that sequencing thing. And there was also, and the chapter, what I really talk about that chapter is the value of surprise and variety in a really tough disagreement. So when you're mired in a really sort of difficult to get your arms around kind of disagreement, where you kind of lost the, you know, nobody's moving from their position, and the disagreement becomes very complex. The thing you can do is introduce humor and variety and unexpected kind of notes. And there's lots of that in that process. In fact, they did a play called Oslo, all about this process, and which is going to be turned into a film, because it's just a fascinating story. The second question, do I talk about inner conflict? No, not much, because then I thought I'd start to sort of lose focus of the book. But you're right, like in the sense that the same principles that I'm talking about can actually be applied to your inner conflict. The one part where I do touch on it is where I say you do have to deal with yourself in it, because you do have to manage your own instinct to be insecure and defensive, and try and keep your eye on the goal of the disagreement, because the other person probably isn't going to do that. And so in a sense, you actually have to do that for both of you.
So I wouldn't normally read this kind of question, but since the topic of the night is conflict, this is one of the more, this is a comment that's more of a dissent. So I'll put it to you. Fred writes, are the only alternatives the kind of confrontational disagreements you described in passive aggression? Why can't there be rational discussion of differences, expressing them passionately but not violently, without it becoming passive aggression? I don't accept this dichotomy.
I don't accept it either. I agree with you. It shouldn't be a dichotomy. But I don't think all disagreement can be rational and calm and kind of free of emotions. And often, you know, the people who think it is are kind of misreading the people that they're disagreeing with. So quite often, one of the imbalances at the relationship level in a disagreement is that somebody is feeling quite emotional and the other person is just not getting it at all. And so they kind of stay ultra rational, whilst the other person kind of boils away, you know, quietly or explosively. And the truth is that we think better when our emotions are engaged. You know, it's funny. I this is not in the book, but here it is, in fact, reading this book recently. So this is a biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher. And in the early section of the book, they describe the conversations about mathematical logic that he had with Bertrand Russell when he was a young man. And they used to really get into these incredibly emotional, sometimes furious, long arguments, incredibly productive arguments about mathematical logic, right? The most abstract subject in the world, the most hyper-rational abstract subject you can possibly think of. But these guys are very emotional about it, and Russell pretty much explicitly says that's why we made so much progress, because our hearts were in it as well as our heads. I in a sense I agree wholeheartedly. It's not a dichotomy. Actually, you know, emotions and rationality go together.
Okay, one final question from Megan. who writes, do you have any advice for how to handle conflict on social media, which you've already mentioned, Ian, where it is more difficult to have a dialogue, where perhaps the other person ignores facts and is attacking, is in the mode of attacking rather than in the mode of discussing or productively arguing?
Yeah. I mean,
avoid it.
avoid it is probably my basic advice. If you can't, now, you might be able to make it go better than most disagreements on social media, but it's very difficult because it's so low context. And in a low context situation, it's very hard to strike up a relationship that's satisfactory to both parties. And so the content disagreement becomes, disrupted by this kind of poisonous relationship that very quickly develops on Twitter or whatever. Now, the only thing I'd say about this is that sometimes you can make it go better. If you follow some of the guidelines that I talk about in the book, you can kind of settle the other person down. Sometimes it's because they're in a kind of low trust environment too. So you're trying to make them trust you that, I'm not actually here. I'm not about to humiliate you. I'm not in here to insult everything you believe in, which most people think is about to happen because it happens all the time on social media. You say, no, I'm like genuinely interested in what you have to say here. And that can make it go better. But I agree, it's very hard.
Final question we ask everyone at Evenings with an Author. Apart from the Wittgenstein biography, what else are you reading, Ian, at the moment?
What else am I reading? I just read a book called The Odyssey by a guy called Homer. He's like this, he's Greek.
Okay, but which translation did you read?
Fagles, Robert Fagles.
Okay. Controversial.
And it was absolutely brilliant. I mean, seriously, I didn't know if I was going to enjoy it or not. But I loved it. And what else have I been reading? The Autobiography of Malcolm X is the book that I'm reading at the moment.
Okay.
And that is also fantastic. It's like a sort of great, almost like Augustine's Confessions. It's a kind of great narrative of moral redemption, but full of great detail, just full of the world of kind of 1930s, 1940s America. So it's a great read. I recommend it.
Would you recommend The Odyssey as well? Is that a great read?
I would. Seriously, it's a good I would actually recommend it. I wouldn't have done that before, but I'm like,
stands the test of time.
It does.
Great, Ian, thank you so much.
This Homer guy's got a future. I think he's the next big thing.
Yeah, actually, we're having him in the fall.
Right. Very good choice.
Exclusively announced.
The fellow.